Kia ora koutou, and thank you everyone for coming along to this session today to join us here from beaming in from Dubai, where COP28 is in full swing, and we're here to bring you some insights from many of our CL signatories and SBC members who are also here on the ground, taking part in all the action. Just to give you an idea of how many New Zealanders here, there's a group chat and there's 96 of us on that group chat, so there's a lot of us here. I want to start by thanking all of our speakers for being up so bright and early because it's 7 a.m. here in Dubai to participate in this webinar and share what will no doubt be very valuable thoughts and reflections of the developments and discussions that we've seen so far here at COP28. A reminder that we'll do our best to hold space for questions at the end, so please start firing them through via the chat function as we go along. And just to give you a flavour of what it's like here in person, this is a 70,000 person event, along with somewhere around the region of 80 to 120,000 people coming daily as visitors over and above that coming into the green zone. That includes government representatives, business leaders, young people, climate scientists, Indigenous peoples, journalists, as well as various other experts and stakeholders. And I thought I'd seen everything, and until I came to this COP, I really hadn't. It's huge, it's crazy, it's slightly overwhelming. As one of our speakers said earlier to me, it's a bit of a roller coaster, it really is, and nothing quite prepares you just for the sheer scale of the thing. I'm just going to start with a couple of very quick observations from myself before I kick into our first panelist, Belinda Mathers. So I suppose from my perspective, we came here with two very clear agendas. The first was to absorb as much as we could to take back into the New Zealand context around the state of the art, if you like, in climate action. We wanted to see close up what other companies were doing and also what other similar organisations to CLC and SBC were doing. And that's been delivered in spades to us. And I suppose the highlight for me so far, and I posted yesterday on LinkedIn on it, was a piece that we went along to on day 1 and day 2 of the COP, which was a first movers group made up of some of the biggest companies in the world who have decided that actually waiting around for government to take action is not going to get them there. They need to move first, and with them they can bring their supply chains and their customers. And that was incredibly insightful for me to be reminded of the fact that our purchasing power as a group is enormous. And so that was extremely valuable. The other takeaway for me on this COP so far, and one of the things that we were hoping to get from it, was to utilise the platform that the World Business Council for Sustainable Development affords us. And I have to say that is an amazingly powerful platform now. Not only have they been working closely with the UAE as in the presidency to influence and affect the agenda, they are using over 60 events to profile and challenge their members. And as part of that, we're able to participate. So it's a reminder that we have a platform on this international stage, and it's really important that we use it. But that's enough from me. I now want to start with the first of our panelists. I want to introduce Belinda Mathers. Belinda is the Chief Science and Advisory Officer for Toitū Envirocare. So Belinda, this isn't your first rodeo, as they say. It's not your first COP. How's this one shaping up in comparison with last year's COP? And what have you taken away from discussions about emissions reporting and voluntary carbon markets so far?
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I think having been last year really helped me with that sense of overwhelm. I knew how it was going to feel for that first couple of days, I guess, in terms of just trying to find your way around, trying to work out the processes, all those sorts of things. So while it wasn't actually easier to do those things, I knew what to expect. So I guess that definitely helped. In terms of the vibe around the place, I've spoken to a couple of people about this over the last day or two, and it's really feeling like there's a sense of we just need to get on with it. We don't have time. Somebody said in a presentation yesterday that you've got to build something and then make it better and then make it mandatory. So it's a lot of talk about not letting perfection getting in the way of good enough and getting things done. So in the spaces that I've been looking at, focusing on things like reporting and the voluntary carbon market space, there's been plenty of announcements and initiatives, as there always are. but it's been really good to see that there's been a real focus on harmonisation and alignment and collaboration between standard setters to make it as easy as possible for businesses to be reporting into multiple platforms, multiple initiatives using the same data. Which is really vital because it's really broadly recognised that businesses don't have unlimited time, don't have unlimited money. So we've got to make the resources we have go as far as possible. So providing really decision useful information is a focus, and sort of harmonisation and making it easy to report has been really positive takeaways from me, because it's something that we've been trying to work on for years. There's all these different things going on. How can we work out what's most important? How can we work out what needs to be aligned with? In the voluntary carbon market space, the carbon credit side of things, we are monitoring what's happening in Article 6. That's the negotiation side of things. But outside the negotiations, there's some really useful conversations around market integrity, market quality, what are expectations. And I was in a session late yesterday where the head of the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative was speaking. And, she was really sort of bringing home that, yes, there's lots of stuff in the media about carbon credits. It's felt like it's been really negative, but actually there's some benefits in there because it's driving quality, and it's reminding us that what we're really trying to do here is have the impact that we need to have. So if without that quality, it's not going to, we can't have confidence in that. So I find it really motivating to be at COP. We're a relatively small market working in our space in New Zealand. We've got lots of leaders, but we don't necessarily have a lot of people to share ideas with in specific technical spaces. So for me, COP's a really good opportunity to make those connections, and everybody's really interested in what's happening in New Zealand as well. It's like,
they certainly are. Thank you, Belinda. That's fantastic, and I'm sure we'll have a whole lot of questions aimed at you in a few minutes' time. So, but I think that's I've had a lot of questions on the mandatory reporting regime that we've had in New Zealand, but also the outstanding work that you guys are doing in the voluntary side of things too. So, thank you for that, Belinda. Look, maybe Amelia, I'll come to you next. So, as Chief Executive of Beca, having a presence at COP has been, I'm sure, very high importance to you and your organisation. Nearly a week in now, what are your biggest insights so far, and how have your expectations fared with the reality of being here?
Yeah, so just to be fair, I'm very newcomer to this. So I arrived here yesterday, and my colleague as well. So we are still getting our feet under the desk, and have got a week to go. So for us, really, we came for the energy discussions today and the Indigenous people discussions today, moving into the climate adaptation stuff. So we're fresh on the block. Just really the scale of the number of people. I am a newcomer. This is our first rodeo, not in contrast to Belinda. And really, it's about how we as a sort of a delivery, practical solutions-based business can work alongside our clients, both in the carbon reduction space, but also really importantly in the adaptation and resilience and in the nature space. So they're the two areas that perhaps I'm most interested in talking to people about on the ground. I just echo Belinda's sentiment that I think you have sort of two sets of conversations going, the negotiations and the political positioning, and then there's a lot of people doing stuff on the ground, demonstrating how things are working in action. I know for us, for example, we're doing some work with Kiribati on how we can collect data to help them with their recovery planning and civil defence emergency planning. And it's getting some insights and being able to see what others are doing and sharing those ideas, getting that sort of technology insight in how those solutions are shaping up. And I think, as you said yourself, Mike, about what people are putting on the ground, that I think is really exciting for us. But for me, I would be, be very clear to say we are effectively newcomers still getting over the scale of everything and what this opportunity looks like, and just finding the information that you want. And I think you were mentioning about the amount of time it takes to get places, but just getting from one area of information that you want to look at to another, just the scale of that is for me probably physically the biggest takeaway at the moment. But as I said, a lot of interest and a lot of optimism in some of the initiatives and ideas that are being put on the ground that we can take back and think about how we can work with our clients on that. It's also the opportunities from some of the connections with our partners, just bringing this international group together. We do a lot of discussions with partners around the world, but this is an opportunity to meet a lot of people face to face. So that's another thing that I'm really looking forward to being able to do. Makes for very long days, but the opportunity to catch up with people that you wouldn't normally see in one place, I think, is something else I'm really looking forward to, and looking forward to getting through my rather full run schedule for the days. So that's probably. I appreciate I've got more time, but I feel as a getting my feet on the ground, that's probably my initial conversations and points that I would make to date. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Amelia. And look, we'll have a chance to interview you after the COP to get some more perspectives, I suppose, once you've particularly been to the Energy Day and those other events as well. My only feedback, having been here a week now, is it's all about comfortable shoes. So thank you very much.
Definitely.
Yeah, exactly. David, as Deputy Chair of the New Zealand Green Investment Finance Group, I just wondered if you might be able to tell us a little bit about particularly yesterday's finance themed day, because I'm sure that was of huge interest to you. Just be interested in any comments that you can make on the outcomes of yesterday's discussions and driving forward the agenda for sustainable finance in general.
Good morning, and thank you very much. And I think that the overall themes that have been coming out of the first week so far have been very much around both the transition finance program and how that's being addressed all over the world, and particularly blended finance and blended finance for developing countries, which was a feature right from the first day from an event hosted by BlackRock. So, and I think we've become used over the years to COP always having lots of interesting discussions, lots of announcements. It's frustrating sometimes because you physically cannot get around enough of the events you want to go to, and the people you want to see. You're in meetings, you're trying to move between locations to get to them. And one of the things that sort of strikes me about some of these big announcements is it's wonderful to launch a $30 billion fund for X or Y, but you still have to process individual deals and get those through. And for small economies like ours, pushing things through at scale is often a challenge. So I think our objective here is to learn, to meet many of the people that we encounter in the market and don't often have chances to talk to, but also to look at the science and some of the things that are changing that will help us in the overall mission of decarbonisation in New Zealand. There's been some really interesting stuff on water security and water scarcity, which we perhaps don't think enough about. There's obviously lots about things like hydrogen, lots about solar, lots about wind. So overall, I mean, the big announcements are terrific, and we follow them with interest, but really it's a question of working through as much as we can in terms of meeting people, talking about things and seeing what's going on and what the interesting stuff is at ground level. There was a very interesting one, for instance, 2 days ago on debt for climate swaps, which is a concept that's been around for a long time, but never really worked terribly well. But the whole issue of climate finance being a colonial heritage issue wasn't something I'd thought about all that much until I heard somebody talking about it. So, yeah, I mean, it's daunting physically because of the distances here, particularly. It's a much bigger area, and you've got several areas around Dubai hosting COP events, but it's terrific fun and really intellectually stimulating and lots to bring back to New Zealand.
That's a really good point, isn't it, David? I feel that here is that we really do feel like sometimes the last bus stop in the world, don't we, in New Zealand? And you really do feel very plugged in here. I don't know if anyone else is just the sense of being on a Star Trek episode, you know, where it's all nations, right? Walking along and seeing everybody dressed in different national dress and everything else is quite stimulating. I just had a follow-up question for you, David, which just in the finance area. Were there any surprises for you in terms of the what was covered yesterday, or things that weren't covered?
I don't think so. I mean, it all seemed fairly logical and pretty much as expected. It's not what goes on at the center stage, it's what goes on around it that's making the real difference. Yeah,
that's a good point. Thank you, David. Claire, turning to you, the transport focus takes place tomorrow, and during which you'll be participating in a number of panels I see on behalf of Christchurch International Airport. What are you hoping to achieve for the aviation sector as part of your time here in Dubai?
Yeah, kia ora, Mike, and folk back home. There's a couple of different layers to what we're trying to achieve over here. One is a really clear message for airports about dialing up that responsibility and basically do better. Within aviation sector, airports have the technology to transition already, and tomorrow we're launching, not Christchurch Airport, sorry, Airport Council International, part of an international body, ICAO, which is the International Civil Aviation Organization, are launching a new best practice standard for airports in terms of their decarbonisation. And I mean, I don't want to announce all of it, but you know, sneaky hint, it was somewhat inspired by the Climate Leaders Coalition High Ambition Pledge. So there's been some borrowing and dialing in of good deep thinking from here in New Zealand and pushing that to an international standard. So really excited about that. That requires airports to have proven 90% reduction in their operational emissions. So not just set targets, have achieved them, as well as science-based targets for Scope 3. And that's a full Scope 3. That's sort of like a 3-page inventory to cover your Scope 3, greenhouse gas protocol aligned. So it's just dialing up the ambition. That's one really important part. Also getting airports to think about energy and infrastructure master planning, because this is a big energy play, ultimately displacing jet fuel, replacing it with green hydrogen and sustainable aviation fuel. So there's very specific airport pieces that we're trying to lean into, just dialing up the ambition. There's some sector pieces. So a week before COP, there was a ICAO, that International Civil Aviation Authority. Gosh, there are so many acronyms. Anyway, so they had a conference on aviation and alternative fuels, and actually came up with quite a progressive goal for the sector, which was leaning into and giving clear signals for the development of SAF, which is sustainable aviation fuel. So we were quite excited to see that come out of that conference, and what they were invited to do was then submit it to the UN Conference of the Parties Framework Convention on Climate. So I went in to watch the negotiations around that and really wish I hadn't. So there's this progressive piece that happened a week ago. Sitting in a negotiating room, I'd sort of forgotten that space where you get block voting. So on one side, you've got the EU, the UK, the US, Australia, Canada, Norway, saying this is really great, this is progressive, we're happy to see this and acknowledge it. On the other side, you have reservations from China, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Egypt, and the room could not even agree to acknowledge the paper from ICAO. So they tried working around, could we note the paper from ICAO? Could we note it with divergent views? And they couldn't land on anything. The piece got postponed, and you're just sort of like, this is a report, which is actually, it's progressive, but it's not world changing. Anyway, so that's just, I guess, part of the challenges of trying to create global consensus. What I took away though was how important New Zealand's role is as a pilot to demonstrate what best practice can look like, particularly in this sector. That's such an important role that we have to play to prove concepts. While we might not be the big players, we certainly have a role to play in that. And then I guess my last takeaway was just loving how climate intersects with all of these themes each day. So as you mentioned, yesterday was finance. It was also gender. And my key takeaway from the sort of gender discussion that I went to see was, hear folk talk about, was that in the energy transition, globally, we're going to need to triple the workforce to support that transition, which 100% means we're going to need to rely and upskill on more women getting into the energy sector. So that was my takeaway. And I was thinking about Christchurch Airport's renewable energy sector in Kōwhai Park and how to get more women techies on the job.
Such an important point there, Claire. And I think it's one of these things where it's not until you get to these international fora, isn't it, that you can kind of stand back and see New Zealand in context. Is that your finding as well? Totally. What is New Zealand's role? Ultimately, nobody thinks we're the big player or having the biggest impact, but actually the impact we have is leadership. It's that ability to prove and pilot and test things and then demonstrate it's possible. Yeah. I'd also agree with you about trying to avoid the big plenary set pieces. They are quite challenging, and watching the sort of people converge on international leaders like a bunch of fanboys is also quite a sight at times, isn't it? Hey, thank you so much for that, Claire. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more questions coming to you in the chat. And just to remind all of those who are online, I said we've got over 50 people online. Please do start putting your questions into the chat. This is your opportunity to ask people who are here right now for their insights. Right, so thank you so much, Claire. I'm going to move now on to Jono. You're Managing Director for Deta, obviously. So you've no doubt been keeping a close eye across all aspects of the discussions here at COP, particularly those relating to energy, I would guess. What would you say are some of your biggest takeaways as you are near the end of week one?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Mike. Kia ora, everyone back in New Zealand. I think just before I answer that, I think answering Claire's point a little bit, just building on that, I think everyone I talk to does see New Zealand as a leader, and I think there's almost a missed opportunity that we're not making the most of that platform with so many New Zealanders here, that we've got such a great story to tell without a pavilion to then tell our story. I think is a bit of a shame, but that's by the by. It is what it is. We've got some great speakers out there presenting at lots of different places around COP. I think the key thing that I've been focused in on, and what's been really interesting from my perspective, is really around process heat and mainly land-based transport, but transport generally. I think the process heat space has been really interesting so far, in that pretty much all of the conversation has been around hydrogen. Very little to date around electrification. And talking to a few people, the focus in most of the world at the moment is the hard to abate sectors. It is those high temperature sectors, it's sustainable aviation fuel, it's those sorts of sectors. And in a lot of ways, they're actually taking the medium temperature heat, and by that I mean less than 300 degrees, so pretty much all of New Zealand's process heat. They're almost just taking that as a given. The technology isn't new. Everyone knows that it's not necessarily easy, but the technology, there's not a lot of discussion about that at all at COP so far, for me. Now, today's the energy day, so there are a few sessions that might lean into that a little bit more, but there's not a lot. And there's not a lot here in the green zone that is showcasing new technology in that space either. I find that really interesting. And I think the challenge with hydrogen, which everyone forgets, and there's very, very little so far in user representation here. So we're talking a lot around the supply side projects, and there's lots and lots of supply opportunities for both solar, renewables, and hydrogen. But at the moment, and I went to a presentation yesterday that said, committed hydrogen projects currently outstrips committed hydrogen demand by about 8 to 1. And so coming up with models and business models that then solve the demand side problem is in a lot of ways as much, if not more important than a lot of the supply side conversations that seem to be the focus so far. I think it's interesting for me coming back to electrification though, particularly around kind of bringing in lots of renewables into the system. All of the challenges we're having around how do we manage a new grid in a more intermittent sort of space, more demand side participation, I guess, in the grid activity, and also how do we integrate storage and what does that storage look like? All of those sorts of things are things that are being tackled across the world. And so I think, again, for me, we don't necessarily have to solve these problems ourselves in isolation. And the part of the value of being here is having those conversations collectively with lots and lots of other people who are all at sort of different stages of their journey. And some are further ahead, which is great, but some are actually just behind or trying to tackle it slightly differently. And I think, yeah, for me, I really think that electrification, how do we get rapid deployment of new renewables in a way that's consistent with regulation and appropriate, approval type processes is a real challenge. And that's one that the world hasn't really tackled in any meaningful way yet.
So true, Jono. And I think this is one of the reasons why it's important not to assume anything, isn't it, once we get here? Assuming that this is all under control is a false assumption. It really is not. So that leadership piece becomes so important, doesn't it?
Agreed. Yeah.
Jono, thanks so much for that. Cal, I'm just going to move to you now. You're obviously here on behalf of WSP, and are likely to make up one of the younger generations participating in COP. I hate saying that. I still think of myself as a younger generation. There you go, I'm not. What are some of the key insights that you're able to share from your time here on the ground so far?
Sure, thanks, Mike. I've been scribbling some notes down to the side. Hey everyone, I work in infrastructure, decarbonisation, and resilience space. I talk about three things. So one, just the stage production that is COP, the experience of being here as a young person, and then some key takeaways from talks. People touched on it earlier. There's hundreds of events on at any one time across, the core presidency events, side events, thematic pavilions, country pavilions, and then offshoot conferences on the side. So, while there's 80, 100,000 people, no two people will have the same experience. Everyone's going to very different events. There's quite a different feeling between the blue zone and the green zone. Green zone being open next to the public, more like a trade fair. Blue zone being where the country pavilions and the negotiations take place. You're more likely to meet like a head of sales for a company in a green zone versus a managing director or a younger activist in the blue zone. I'm just amazed by the public engagement of some relatively high-profile people, the likes of, say, Tony Blair, John Kerry, Bill Gates, who've been giving presentations. It's been really interesting. There was substantial security in the first few days with the World Climate Action Summit, where leaders came to visit, and we were all ushered around, make sure no one was in line of sight of them. But it's relaxed a little bit since then. Yeah, so as I'm the Gen Z rep on this panel, so to say, I suppose there's always that imposter syndrome piece coming to an event like this. Do you deserve to be here? Have you done enough? Are people going to dismiss you? I've found that's not the case at all. Everyone's more than willing to have a chat. They're interested in hearing what's going on in New Zealand, as that might not make their way into the circles they're in at their home country. There's a strong presence of youth, especially in the negotiators as well. I know with a couple from New Zealand involved in that as well, like Tom and Michelle Mearclem. So good on them. And then maybe just a few takeaways. That some are lighthearted, like how tiny Hillary Clinton is in real life. I think the campaign trail camera clearly adds a foot or so. But and then on a more serious note, hoping private finance's deep pockets. Almost every second presentation I go to seems to call on private finance to fund this transition, and reiterate that public finance or governments won't have the reserves to fund this. Some really interesting presentations. World Business Council for Sustainable Development, WBCSD, spoke about a new avoided emissions framework they're putting out. So Belinda might be able to speak more on this, but their premise was that greenhouse gas inventory accounting it's important, but it won't get us to where we need to go. So to be able to demonstrate that certain investments are, say, beneficial across a whole of life perspective, bringing in that kind of impact accounting or avoided emissions piece is going to be important. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank spoke about nature as infrastructure, reiterating one of the points earlier on progress over perfection. We just don't have time to figure out how it's going to be perfect before we get going. One interesting takeaway was some of their modeling suggests that negative ESG press does negatively impact share prices. So that's hopefully an interesting takeaway for this group. The World Benchmarking Alliance, they gave a really interesting presentation yesterday in the Buildings Pavilion, and one of the takeaways was that 0% of companies are aligned with just transition, regardless of how they're doing in terms of other progress and other metrics like scope 1, 2, 3 reductions. And just on that piece of New Zealand being a proof of concept, yes, I totally agree. At WSP, we like to think of New Zealand as being a perfect environment for being a sandbox for the rest of the world to develop some develop solutions that we can then push out. Maybe just to leave you with one somewhat controversial point. Ajay Banga, the president of the World Bank, he was challenged on the $7 trillion of fossil fuel subsidies coming away. And he made the point that, well, they're not all necessarily unjustified. He gave the example of providing cooking gas to the global south or the developing world at a price point below wood or coal. That's a deal he'd make any day. Don't have an opinion on that, but I just thought it was interesting hearing all these different perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you, Cal. That was a fantastic summary there. And I thought I'd also just bring in a couple of things that you raised in there on WBCSD. In addition to the piece on avoided emissions was the CEO guide to climate-related corporate performance and accounting systems, otherwise known as CPAS. And that's quite an interesting guide, which we'll be profiling when we get back. I think it's relatively complementary to the work we're doing in New Zealand, but again, it's just an example of some of those things that are happening at the international level. The second comment I just wanted to make, it was actually a point that following on from Jono's point around the green zone and the trade fair element of it. So the green zone is actually 4 times the size of the blue zone, and will have over 400,000 people will go through it. So just to give you an idea of scale, it's kind of massive. A lot of the conversation that's been had over the last few days is whether this is a one-off, whether this is, a typical UAE and Dubai, massive scale, very private sector oriented, everything else, or whether in fact this has set a precedent which might have implications for other countries. And so I think that's going to be quite interesting. I have a little green zone story, which is we'd gotten on a practice run to make sure that we could get to the green zone and back in time between 2 particular events. Unfortunately, as Cal was talking about, they'd gone sectioned off this whole middle section so that the very important VIPs could come in and not be touched by anybody. That had the unintended consequence that a 10-minute walk turned into a 2.5-hour nightmare as we caught various types of public transport walked. I think I did something like 25,000 steps that day. So that was an example of just how crazy this place can be. Right, now we've got some questions here for the team. The first one is, how was New Zealand's image on the world stage? Noting the recent announcement of us winning Fossil of the Day, it's actually Fossil of the Day award rather than Fossil of the Year, due to the U-turn on oil and gas exploration ban. Was there a vibe of this risking international agreements, or are we too small? Any feedback from the panel?
I think if I go first, Mike, I think it was a bit embarrassing, but because we all heard about it here, but we probably noticed it more than other countries really noticed it. It was it's not going to affect any international agreement. It's not going to affect anything other than our own concern with what we're doing and how we're positioning ourselves. And it came the same time we had not signed another agreement that day, because it's a caretaker and government situation, and therefore can't commit to certain things. So minor embarrassment, but not a big deal. Just something it helps us all to sort of think about what we're doing.
Yeah, indeed. And I did check in with MFAT on this, and two things, I suppose. One is we've had a Fossil of the Day award for 8 out of the last 10 COPs for a variety of things. And part of that is because we've got such an engaged civil society in New Zealand who are happy to nominate us up for these Fossil of the Days. But I agree about the embarrassment. And the other good news is that we have now signed up officially to the tripling of renewable energy globally. And again, it was an issue around logistics. Basically, the minister literally had only been in place for 2 days. There was a challenge getting him to see the document. So that's now been signed up to. Claire, you also had a comment that you were going to make, I think.
Yeah, I've had a couple of conversations with, I suppose, climate activists that have been there and noted with disappointment, the change in New Zealand's leadership around climate, and I suppose the high regard that Prime Minister Ardern was held in, and then just questioning what is going on in New Zealand. Is this really what New Zealanders think? And it's a little bit hard to answer that question, to be honest. But from outside, from just, I guess, activists that are really at the conference to try and make an impact, the folk that have asked me about it have noted with disappointment some of the U-turns.
Very interesting. Very interesting. And as you'll know, for anyone who's been before, the activists can be extremely loud. There was some fantastic chanting going on yesterday that you could hear on the 3rd floor of one of the buildings. I was up there and you could hear the chanting from the top. The next question is from Tom Kelly. Claire, Jono, great New Zealand seen as leaders. In what ways?
Well, I mean, maybe I could tackle that one first. Sorry, Claire. So I think that, I get lots of questions around some of the work that we've done around electricity. So, people are keen to hear more about our renewable mix. So, everyone's striving to be 70+% renewable in their electricity system. And I think they're really interested to know how we operate at a 90+% renewable system. The one thing I would say is that the world's rapidly catching up. Like, they're going to be quite renewable quite soon. So I think, there's an opportunity for New Zealand to show that leadership and share that knowledge around how we integrate those systems. And then there's some technology knowledge around that as well that can be shared, particularly geothermal wind. I think the other thing for me is I get lots of questions around ag, and we haven't got to the ag day yet. But I think, again, I hope there's an opportunity for us to showcase some of the great stuff we're doing in ag, recognising there's still lots more to do. But actually, I think New Zealand has a story to tell there that can share some information to the rest of the world too.
Absolutely, John. And just on that, AgriZero will be showcasing their work of the Ag Day, which is on this Sunday. And Miles Hurrell, CEO of Fonterra, this will be the first time that he comes to COP, and there'll be a very large ag contingent here this weekend. Claire.
I was going to say, in relation to that question about what can we do to model that leadership, I think it's really it's the process that we can follow. In a sense, we recognise there's a problem to solve. We get really innovative. I think that's something that New Zealand is really good at, figuring out sort of creative solutions to things. We have much easier, and I know this will sound really maybe shocking to some of us, but much easier regulatory access and infinitely easier access to our decision makers, and particularly through platforms like SBC and CLC. But you can literally first name dot last name at parliament.govt.nz, any MP, and you'll get a reply, and that is so rare compared to what a lot of other folk have. So we've got easy access to decision makers, clever folk like Beca and Deta and WSP, and and all the other panelists thinking about technical solutions and the relatively clean grid. And I think that as a whole allows us to make model examples of how you solve solutions across supply chains. And that's what's really interesting, because there are pretty much no isolated solutions that work anymore. Everything has a supply chain attached to it. So we're going through a transition. We also need the technical solution, we need the regulatory framework, we need the financing, and we have access across those elements in a relatively easier way than most. So we can line it all up and demonstrate that's how you'd need to do it.
Another area that another area that I've noted is in this climate-related disclosure space. So, for an example, California has recently passed legislation in that space, and through contacts that I've got in California, I've been now invited to a closed room session this afternoon to talk about New Zealand's experience and what worked here and what process we went through, where the director of the agency that's been tasked with implementing that legislation in California is really after some insights from New Zealand, which is really exciting.
Absolutely, Belinda. And I think sometimes in New Zealand, we don't appreciate quite where we are internationally. I was sitting in a session on agriculture, and the person said in conclusion, what we really need here is some kind of climate leaders kind of coalition of some sort. And I thought, oh, well, tick, we'll go with those. And then, and really what we also need, particularly in the agriculture sector, is some kind of public-private partnership which would see us driving down methane emissions. And I went up to him afterwards and I said, well, there's the CLC and there's AgriZero. So it's just a reminder that, you know, just because we're at the bottom of the world doesn't mean we actually can't show some leadership. Which brings me to Roger Robson's point, question here, which is, I suppose, building on Tom's one, which is, kia ora, good to see Te Rāsau ably represented at COP. Thank you. What can we collectively do to better position New Zealand as a leader in global climate action? I think that's a sort of a build on. I wonder, Cal, do you want to kick off on that one? I think it would be interesting to have your insights on how you think we could do this better at COPs in future.
Interesting. Finding the presentations are quite hit or miss. Some of them, you know, are absolutely fantastic. You've got a technical expert there just going pretty fast and throwing out fantastic stats and insights. And others, you know, there's a panel of 25 people and everyone's got 30 seconds to say something, and you can tell one of their staffers wrote their speech word for word. I'd really like to see workshops going forward. So say get people into a room and actually sit them down and talk through solving something. What could New Zealand do? Well, maybe we could start with, say, presenting something we're doing, get a group together, say through one of these forums like the CLC or SPC, talk through what we're doing on a certain topic and then actually workshop it with other people from across the world. Yeah, that'd be my point.
Fantastic. Any other comments on this one?
Mike, just to follow Cal, that's something we're doing as NZGIF on Friday with the ADB, talking about green banks in Asia, in Southeast Asia in particular, why other people aren't doing them, what our experience has been and how it's working. And to a couple of the other points, you know, on New Zealand leadership, you do see us perceived as among smaller countries, one who've really thought a lot ahead, done a lot, and our sustainable finance platform, the way our Toitū is organized, is something that Joe Kelly's been in plenty of conversations about during the week. So leveraging the connections made through that and enabling New Zealand to position itself and run workshops like the one with ADB is, I think, a real advantage for us.
I think so too, David. And in fact, I can just speak to this from an SPC and CLC perspective. One of the reasons that we haven't been front-loading this as much as maybe we haven't had people here who've experienced COP. And I think now that Antonio and myself have been here from this side, I mean, obviously Antonio has been involved in the negotiations, but from a business perspective, I think we've got a much better idea of just how much we could profile, not just the great work that people here are doing, but the work that some of our organizations like CLC and SPC could be profiled as well. We've also learned, get in early and sometimes it's the unexpected venues. David, you're talking about doing something with the Asian Development Bank. Who would have thought that could be a thing? But there it is. So sort of taking those opportunities. Just moving on, there's a question here from David Ross. To what extent is nature and biodiversity combined or differentiated at COP? Really good question there. Any thoughts from the panel?
I haven't been following it sort of actively, but in some of the presentations that I've been part of, certainly nature-based solutions, are discussed in some detail. So I think that there's recognition that they're both massive problems to solve, and there's a real opportunity about solving the climate and the nature problem together rather than trying to do it separately because they're so interlinked.
Yeah, that's a good point. Any other comments from the panel?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I went
Sorry.
to the green zone and went into the sustainability pavilion, and they had just such an exceptional display or way of making tangible the planetary boundaries, as well as a really incredibly moving representation of forestry, biodiversity and nature and ocean, and really unpacking or elevating the importance of protecting our oceans. So I don't think, have we had the theme day in relation to biodiversity yet?
No,
I'm not sure.
Not yet.
Yeah,
It's on,
so I
it's
think
on Saturday.
Yeah, but what I saw on the public side was some incredibly impressive elevating of these issues, and again the intersection with climate and.
Absolutely.
I think if I could just build on that too, sorry, Mike, that one thing I think that's starting to bubble to the surface a little bit in the discussions that I'm part of is, in some ways, we don't yet have a mandate to drive the outcomes of COP from the communities that we're all part of. So I think, in the New Zealand kind of government context is a little bit like that, but that's true of the world a little bit too. And I think there's a little bit of concern that, and an awareness that we're not really doing a great job of taking everyone on the journey together. And I think the biodiversity, nature-based solutions are a massive part of that. So, what do we want the world or New Zealand to look like in 2050? I don't think anyone is really aligned around the call to action and what that looks like, and therefore we don't necessarily have the mandate to make some of the harder decisions or make some of the changes to the economy or to how we operate or to New Zealand Inc. that we actually need to. So I think in terms of leadership, linking back to the earlier question, that might be an opportunity for NZ to lead the world and be really crystal clear and aligned as an entire country around what are we trying to achieve. Because if we know that, it's a lot easier to then put stepping stones in towards that. And that goes across biodiversity, nature, the energy system, the whole thing kind of links back to that. But we need to be able to articulate that to lay people, not people who know these acronyms and are massively into energy.
I think that's so important, Jono. What this reminds me of is where the trade conversation was 10 years ago in New Zealand. And it really wasn't until there was that, I don't know if you remember, but there was that massive piece of fallout that MFAT had to clean up on with our trade policy. And now we've got a trade for all policy where we engage much more with the New Zealand public. And I would 100% agree. I think there would be very few New Zealanders who actually know why it's worthwhile even being at COP and what New Zealand's role is there. So I think there's a role for business in educating around that area. And just on that one, I just wanted to point out that the South African pavilion here is paid for by the private sector and driven by the private sector. And they then invite the South African government to be a part of their pavilion, not the other way around. And they've done that for 15 years. Basically, the corporate sector pay for it. And it's worthwhile going along to the South African pavilion because it's really vibrant and they are super organized. And it's just a thought, something to think about. Because it's not something that we've ever done, and it's interesting. And when I asked them why do they do it, and they said, well, the government was never going to pay for it, so we decided that we'd just lead out. Originally, they described it as a shoebox with a light in it, but it's got larger and larger, and it's quite big now. The other point I just wanted to make is that the trade nature and agriculture days are all new to COP. We've never had them before. And I found the nature one particularly astounding, that hasn't been part of COPs before, but it hasn't. And of course, there is a separate nature COP, as we know. We're up to, I think, COP 15 or 16 or whatever it is there. So to answer that question, I still think it's pretty siloized, David. I think that it's there's a lot of opportunity here for much greater integration between the climate agenda and the nature agenda. Right, we've got some more questions here. Is there any sense or evidence yet of this COP being more about action than one of commendable commitments, especially around finance? Great question. It's a finance question, so I'm actually going to throw, I might throw this to you, David, in the first instance, but we'll take it more broadly as well.
I think there's definitely a sense of wanting to get on with things, not simply talk about it. Belinda said that earlier, that let's just get going and do things. And I think the way we came here intending to build connections and meet people and talk about what we can do together and how we can do it, that's what we're here for. I think everybody we're talking to feels the same way. So there's some great speaking from people like BlackRock, but it's what's going on behind the scenes and what the different banks are doing, the stuff DZ Bank is doing, the stuff that HSBC is doing, the sessions that they're involved in some cases simply advertising and showcasing deals, but it's putting deals out there and showing people what can be done rather than sitting back and waiting for things to happen. You're on mute, Mike.
Love that. Are there any other comments from the panel? No, my only observation would be that I think there are three kinds of action happening here, to David's point. There is the very visible announcements, of which there are dozens per day. And to me, a lot of that's creating a lot of noise. So, no disrespect to our hosts, but making an announcement about $100 million into nature, which is what the UAE did on day one, sounds very great until you consider that they make about $61 to $62 billion a year in revenue from oil and gas in any given year. So a fund over 5 years of 100 million suddenly looks a little paltry. So there's a lot of that stuff going on, and look, it makes for great sound bites and it gets out into social and everything else. But is it that significant? Probably not. There's the negotiation, which, as we know, is probably the most significant piece. And I'm slightly stunned by how much the negotiation has been overwhelmed by the circus that now surrounds it. There is active discussion going on as to whether negotiation should just occur exactly the same time of year at exactly the same location, rather than moving it around the place, because there's a sense that it's a bit of a distraction moving the negotiation from place to place. And I've got some sympathy with that. This year's negotiation, as was outlined very nicely by some former speakers, is likely to be a mixed bag. And the big question for me is whether or not they can do anything more in the fossil fuels space, given where we are. And then, of course, the third thing are the connections that happen here and a lot of the partnerships that form from people being here in the first place. And I'd be interested to hear from the panel on that point. Have you met people here? Have you connected with people who have either inspired you, or maybe it's an opportunity for doing something in a different way, or maybe even it's led to a business opportunity? Any kind of connections and partnerships that you've made while you've been here that you can talk about?
I guess there's always connections that you make, and really just the people that you sort of go out and talk to, off the cuff, can be some really useful ones. So, and I guess an example for us is we've been following the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market for a while. Went to a presentation on my first day. It was horribly jet lagged, didn't really feel up to asking questions and those sorts of things. But the next morning, I was in a space having a cuppa, and one of the speakers was there. And so I, sought her out, and we had a really useful conversation. She's the Chief Operating Officer for that that initiative. And she said, oh yeah, actually I know people from New Zealand. I've been trying to kind of connect some dots and work out what our work might mean for New Zealand, and I just hadn't been able to work that out. And in a 10-minute conversation, she had much more clarity about our situation. So I think there's just lots of little opportunities rather than sort of big announcements, and those sorts of things can make a huge difference.
Absolutely.
I know we're running out of time, but I'd agree with Belinda completely. I think we had a few pre-planned meetings, but pre-planned meetings with bigger players are very difficult. There are other occasions to see the bigger players, and you have to respect that. But lots of chances to meet smaller countries and organizations that are doing really interesting things, and so many places where you just run into people.
Absolutely. And just on that point, we've only got a few minutes to go, so I just wanted a little plug for those on the line here and the others who might be listening. Remember, Building 88, Level 2 is where the building and business area is. You're all able to go there. It's sponsored by WBCSD and a couple of others. It's a great place to connect with people. World Trade Organization, a whole lot of others are all plugged into that area as well. And Building 89 right next door to it, which is the Nature Building, also a great place to hang out if you want to do a lot of networking. I've found those useful places to be. Right, we've got one last question and then we're going to wrap it up. Has there been any discussion about 1.5? It looks unlikely to be achieved, and what then for all our relevant targets? Great question. It's a targets question. So I'm going to send it over to you, Belinda, in the first instance.
There has been talk about 1.5. There's not been very sort of positive conversations, I guess. There's absolutely recognition that that window's closing, right? So, in fact, I was talking to a fellow who their pavilion is called Road to 1.5 Pavilion. He said, we might just have to change the name of it next year. But I think that people don't want to give up on that just yet, recognizing it's getting really hard, but the closer we can get to that, the better we all are. Muted again, Mike.
Twice I've done that now. There must be a penalty. Thank you so much, everybody. I want to, first of all, sincerely thank our speakers for participating today. I know you had to get up very early, and we wish you all the best for the rest of your time here in Dubai. Thank you to everybody who's come online to listen to this. I hope it's been useful. If you're hungry for more, we're co-hosting another upcoming webinar in partnership with Chapter Zero that's taking place on Thursday, the 7th of December. So do come along to that, as well as contributing to Toitū Envirocare's post-COP session. So if you check out our website, you can get more details on that. And we'll also be following up sending out a follow-up email with links to the recording of the session. One last thing is we are putting together a final report from COP, where we will be synthesizing many of the wonderful people on this group and getting other insights as well, and bringing all that together as a kind of a New Zealand package. So look out for that as well. Thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon where you are, morning where we are. Look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.